At my grandmother's funeral, while my family clawed at her $12 million and stripped me bare in front of her grave, an old man leaned close through the rain and whispered 5 words that changed everything. Your grandmother trusted only you. In that moment, I realized I hadn't just lost everything I had been given, the one key that could bury their greed forever. The fog clung to the trees that morning at Forest Park Cemetery in Portland, and the March air bit through my coat, as if it knew my grief was already sharp enough. I stood by the casket of my grandmother Eleanor, the one person who ever made me feel like I belonged. The priest's voice was low and steady, but it was drowned out by the restless murmurs of my family. They were not mourning. Their eyes were not on her casket, but on the number 12 million, the value of everything she had built and saved. I kept my hands folded tight, trying to steady myself. I was 34 years old, a history teacher who had long accepted that I would never measure up to the Whitmore name in my parents' eyes. My father, Richard, 61, a powerful real estate attorney in Portland, adjusted his silver tie and looked as though this funeral was nothing more than a courtroom. My mother, Susan, 58, in her black designer dress, dabbed her eyes with a silk handkerchief. Though no tears had touched her face, they looked impeccable, untouchable, and I felt invisible standing in the same line of blood. The priest finished his prayer, and for a moment there was silence. I closed my eyes, trying to remember the way Grandma Eleanor laughed when she slipped me cookies at the dinner table, the way she called me Daniel with a warmth no one else could muster. Then the silence shattered. Richard's voice cut through the air, cold and sharp. He did not care that we were at the edge of a grave, that mourners stood around us with bowed heads. He spoke loud enough for every cousin, uncle, and distant aunt to hear. Daniel will not see a single dollar of this estate. He has done nothing to deserve it. He is not a Whitmore worth the name. My chest tightened. My fists curled at my sides. I wanted to believe he was too blinded by his hunger to realize what he had just said, but I knew better. This was deliberate. He wanted to strip me in front of everyone to remind me that in his court of judgment, I was guilty of weakness, guilty of choosing a life of teaching instead of chasing wealth. I felt dozens of eyes turn to me. Some were wide with shock, others smirked with satisfaction. I caught the look of my cousin David, Gregory's son, his mouth twitching with a grin as if he had been waiting for this moment. Susan's voice came next, sweet as poison. She folded her arms and spoke with practiced calm. Mother spoiled him for too long. He never learned how to carry our name with pride. Look at him, a schoolteacher who hides behind books. She shook her head as if disappointed by a child. He is not worthy of this family or its fortune. Every word seared into me, not because they were new, but because they were spoken here over the coffin of the woman who had loved me most. The murmurs around the casket grew louder. My Uncle Gregory, 55, a broad man with hands rough from construction, leaned against a column nearby. He smirked, arms crossed, his silence more cruel than words. He had always hovered like a shadow behind my father, and now he looked pleased to watch me shrink. I tried not to look at them, but I caught the eyes of a neighbor of Grandma's, Mrs. Hanley, an older woman who had baked me pies when I was a boy. Her eyes flicked to mine with pity before sliding away. No one said a word to stop them. No one challenged the cruelty. The shame clung to me like smoke. My throat burned. I wanted to shout that I never cared about the 12 million, that I only cared about her, that the woman in the coffin was the one who believed in me when they never did. But my voice caught, and I knew if I spoke it would crack. So I kept my lips pressed tight, teeth grinding, while humiliation pressed down on me. The casket lowered slowly into the ground. The ropes creaked, and the finality of it filled the air. This should have been a moment of dignity, of farewell, but instead, it had been twisted into a spectacle of greed. My family stood around me, their black clothes immaculate, their faces hard, their whispers full of calculations and accusations. Inside, something broke. It was not just the grief of losing Eleanor. It was the realization that I had nothing left, no shield, no family who would ever defend me. The woman who loved me was gone, and those who remained were stripping me bare before the grave. I stared at the wet grass, my breath uneven. I could feel the sting in my chest, the weight of their words echoing again and again. Not worthy, not family, nothing. The night had not yet fallen, but in my heart it was already dark. That was the night I lost everything. Rain pattered steadily against the back steps of the church as I sat alone in the dark. My suit damp and heavy on my shoulders. The lights from the reception hall glowed faintly through stained glass, but I could not bring myself to go inside where the laughter and the whispers had already turned to talk of inheritances and lawyers. My head hung low, and the wet wood beneath me smelled of moss and old pine. I heard footsteps behind me and stiffened. At first I thought it was one of my cousins, maybe David, coming to gloat. But when I turned, I saw an older man moving carefully across the slick pavement. He had a cane tucked under his arm and wore a long coat that looked older than I was. His hair was white, his eyes sharp even in the dim light. "Daniel," he said softly, and for a moment I wondered how he knew my name until I recognized him. Mr. Alden, my grandmother's friend, a retired attorney who had visited her often in her last years. He had been at holiday dinners when I was younger, quiet and watchful, and my grandmother had always spoken of him with respect. I tried to stand, but he raised his hand, motioning me to stay seated. He stepped closer and placed a firm hand on my shoulder. His grip was surprisingly strong, steady like an anchor. He leaned down close enough that the rain muffled his voice for everyone but me. "Your grandmother trusted only you." 5 words. Simple, but they cut through the fog of shame and anger in my chest like a sudden flame. I froze, staring at him, unsure if I had heard him right. Trusted only me. The words echoed in my mind, louder than the rain, louder than my father's condemnation. I searched his face for explanation, but he was already reaching inside his coat. He pulled out a small envelope worn at the edges, sealed with care. My name was written across the front in handwriting I knew instantly. The loops of the letters, the steady curve of the D, it was hers. Eleanor's. My throat tightened. I reached out slowly, hesitant, as though the paper might crumble if I touched it. The weight of it felt heavier than it should, as though it carried more than paper, as though it carried her voice. Mr. Alden's gaze never left mine. She asked me to keep this until the time was right. Tonight felt like that time. I wanted to ask why. Why not earlier? Why not in her final days when I could have spoken to her one last time? But the words died in my throat. The rain filled the silence instead. I tucked the envelope inside my jacket, feeling the edges against my chest. A strange warmth spread through me, battling the cold that had seeped into my bones all day. "Thank you," I whispered. My voice cracked. He nodded once. "She loved you, Daniel. Do not forget that when the rest of them try to make you believe otherwise." His hand squeezed my shoulder one last time, then he straightened and stepped back into the shadows. The cane tapped softly against the stone as he disappeared toward the parking lot. I sat there alone again, but everything had shifted. The casket was buried, the mourners had gone home, but in my pocket rested a sealed truth. My family thought they had stripped me bare, but they did not know about this envelope. I pulled it out once more, staring at her handwriting, blurred slightly by raindrops. My fingers shook. I wanted to tear it open right there, but fear held me back. What if it was nothing more than words of comfort, a reminder to stay strong? What if it carried no secret, no revelation, only a farewell? Still, the thought of her trusting only me was enough to draw me to my feet. I walked away from the churchyard down the dark street lined with wet cars and silent trees, the envelope pressed against my chest. When I reached my own car, I sat behind the wheel for a long time, listening to the rain drum the roof. My reflection in the glass looked hollow, but in my eyes there was a flicker of something I had not felt in years. Hope, fragile but real. I did not open the envelope that night. I wanted to, but I needed to feel her presence a little longer before breaking the seal. Instead, I drove home slowly through the empty Portland streets, headlights cutting through sheets of rain. The city was quiet, almost mournful, as if it too had lost someone. When I stepped inside my apartment, I laid the envelope gently on the table beside my keys. I stood there staring at it until my eyes blurred. My grandmother's voice seemed to whisper in my memory, urging me to be patient, to breathe. I finally sat down, the apartment silent except for the rain against the windows. I traced my name on the paper again and again, each stroke of her handwriting a reminder that even in her absence she had chosen me. My chest ached with the weight of that choice, trusted only me. I whispered it to myself until the words filled the room. I leaned back in the chair, exhaustion washing over me. But the envelope remained in my sight. It was no longer just a piece of paper. It was the last tether to the woman who had believed in me when no one else did. That night, for the first time since the funeral, I felt the faintest spark of strength. I did not know what the letter contained, but I knew this much. Whatever lay inside was not meant for my father, my mother, or my uncle. It was meant for me alone. And that knowledge, more than anything, kept me awake until the first light of morning touched the window. Morning light spilled across my kitchen table, and the envelope sat there waiting as if it had been staring at me all night. My hands were restless. I made coffee but never drank it. Paced the apartment, then finally sat back down. The edges of the envelope were soft from where I had held it too long. My name written in her hand still looked alive. I drew a deep breath and slid a finger under the seal. The paper tore softly and the scent of old ink drifted up. Strange how even that small thing felt like her presence. Inside was a folded letter and something small wrapped in tissue. My chest tightened as I unfolded the letter, her handwriting flowing, steady and certain. Daniel, if you are holding this, it means I am gone. You must know why I chose you. Others will reach for wealth, but you carry something they never valued, a heart I could trust. My eyes blurred, but I forced myself to keep reading. There is a key enclosed. It belongs to a safe deposit box at Wells Fargo in downtown Portland. Only you can open it. Inside you will find things you must protect, not for greed, but for truth. These are the pieces of our family story that were hidden, the proof of what I could not speak in life. My hand shook. Proof. Truth. My father's cold stare at the grave, my mother's words of contempt, my uncle's smirk, all of it flared through my mind. What could she have hidden that needed protection from her own children? I turned to the end of the letter. If the time comes and they press you, remember you are not powerless. There is also a home by the sea in Cannon Beach. No one else knows. It is yours. Keep it safe. Let it remind you of who you are, not who they tell you to be. She had signed her name with the same flourish she always used on birthday cards. Eleanor. The tissue in the envelope rattled softly in my palm. I unwrapped it carefully. A small brass key gleamed in the light, the numbers etched on the tag. My chest rose and fell fast. A key to something more than money. A key to secrets. I sat back, letter spread before me, key heavy in my hand. My grandmother had planned this quietly, deliberately, while my father boasted of his court victories and my mother paraded her boutiques. She had been preparing me for a fight I never knew was coming. For a long moment I could not move. The apartment was silent but for the hum of the refrigerator. Outside, a bus roared down the street and the city moved as though nothing had changed but everything inside me had. I whispered her words again. Protect the truth. I placed the letter back on the table, careful not to crease it further, and stared at the key. Wells Fargo, downtown Portland. The thought of walking into that bank, announcing myself using this key, made my stomach churn. My father's voice echoed in my head, laughing at the idea that I, his failed teacher's son, could hold anything of value. But Eleanor had trusted me. She had written it clearly, no hesitation. She had even left me a home that no one knew existed, a cottage by the sea that sounded like something out of a story. I remembered the summers she took me to Cannon Beach as a child, the smell of salt, the sound of gulls. Had she already owned a place there and never told anyone? I closed my fist around the key until the edges pressed into my skin. The sting felt grounding. The morning stretched on. My phone buzzed with messages from relatives, thinly veiled barbs about the funeral, about what was next. I let them go unanswered. I could not look at them without hearing their voices at the grave. Instead, I packed the letter and the key into my jacket pocket. My steps felt heavier but steadier as I left the apartment. The air outside was cold and damp, the streets slick from last night's rain. Each footstep echoed in my ears as if reminding me of the path I was about to take. The bank rose ahead of me later that morning, glass and steel gleaming under gray skies. I stopped at the doors, staring at my reflection. A man who had been called worthless just hours ago. My hand pressed against the pocket where the key rested. I did not walk in yet. Not then. My breath caught and I stepped back to the curb. The letter's words played again in my mind. Protect the truth. The cottage by the sea. It was too much all at once. I could feel the weight of eyes that were not even there, my father's, my mother's, the whole family waiting to pounce if they knew. I turned away from the doors, walking quickly, my shoes slapping the wet pavement. I found myself back in my car, the key burning against my chest, the city rushing past. I gripped the wheel tight, my heart pounding. I knew one thing for certain. My grandmother had prepared a secret beyond their greed, something none of them expected. That thought stayed with me as I drove aimlessly through Portland, past bridges and coffee shops and the river glinting under gray skies. My fingers brushed the key again, and for the first time in years I felt the faint rise of defiance. They had humiliated me, tried to erase me, but in my pocket was the proof that I mattered to the only one who had ever truly seen me. And as the day wore on, I realized she had left me more than just property or numbers. She had left me a weapon hidden in plain sight, waiting for me to use it when the time came. The courthouse smelled of varnished wood and paper, the kind of place where silence was heavier than words. I sat on the stiff bench outside the probate courtroom, my hands clasped tight, as the second hand on the clock ticked louder than my own thoughts. A bailiff opened the door, called my name, and I rose with legs that felt like they carried stones. Inside the room was bright with high windows and polished floors. My father Richard sat at one table in his dark tailored suit, his silver hair gleaming under the lights. My mother Susan beside him looked like she was attending a gala, her black dress pressed to perfection, her pearl earrings catching the light with every tilt of her head. At their side was my Uncle Gregory, broad-shouldered in a gray jacket. His eyes restless, but his smirk steady. Their lawyer shuffled papers with a confidence that matched theirs. On the opposite side sat no one. There was no advocate for me, no voice to represent what my grandmother may have wanted. I was called only as a witness, a formality, a piece on the board that they thought they already owned. Judge Keller, a man in his early 60s with sharp lines around his eyes, entered and took his seat. His gavel struck once, and the sound carried like thunder. He adjusted his glasses and scanned the courtroom. This proceeding concerns the estate of Eleanor Whitmore, valued at $12 million. We will hear arguments regarding the distribution as presented in the will and by counsel. My father rose smoothly, his voice calm but sharpened with years of practice in courtrooms. He spoke of his dedication to the family legacy, his responsibility to manage the estate wisely, his decades of building the Whitmore name. Susan nodded along, her expression carefully composed. Gregory added a few lines about how he had supported the family's enterprises, his construction company tied closely to family wealth. It was all performance, each word polished, each gesture rehearsed. I sat quietly until my name was called. The bailiff led me to the witness stand, and I placed my hand on the Bible, swearing to tell the truth. My voice was hoarse when I said the words, but they came out steady enough. The lawyer for my parents began. "Mr. Whitmore, you are a teacher at Jefferson High School, correct?" "Yes. You do not work in real estate. No, you do not manage investments, nor have you ever been involved in the family's businesses." "That is true." He leaned closer to the table, voice carrying for the room to hear. "And yet you believe you have some claim to your grandmother's estate." I opened my mouth, but my father's voice cut through, sharp and deliberate. "He does not. Daniel has no claim, no right, no standing. Mother loved him, but love is not the same as legacy." The words landed heavy. Whispers rippled through the benches where relatives sat. Some glanced at me, others looked away, unwilling to be caught watching my humiliation again. Judge Keller raised his hand, signaling for order, but my father pressed on. "He is a schoolteacher, Your Honor. He chose to walk away from the Whitmore path. He has no role here beyond sentiment, and sentiment does not divide an estate." I gripped the wooden edge of the stand, forcing my voice steady. "I never asked for their money." Laughter, low and sharp, slipped from Gregory's throat. My mother's lips curved into a cold smile. Richard's jaw tightened, and he shook his head as if my words proved his point. In the back row, a familiar face caught my eye. Emily Parker, my friend from college who had gone on to become a young attorney, sat quietly with her notebook on her lap. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her eyes locked on me. When our eyes met, she gave the smallest nod, a gesture so subtle I might have missed it if I had blinked. It steadied me in a way I could not explain. The lawyer continued. "Mr. Whitmore, your father is correct. The estate is a matter of legal entitlement, not personal affection. Do you claim otherwise?" I hesitated. The envelope and the key in my apartment weighed on my thoughts like a hidden stone in my pocket. My grandmother's words pressed into me. "Protect the truth." I swallowed hard. "I claim only that my grandmother loved me," I said quietly. "And that should matter to someone in this room." A silence followed, colder than any laughter. Richard exhaled through his nose. Susan turned her face away. Gregory shook his head. Judge Keller finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "This court will review the will in full, and I will decide based on the law, not on personal grievances. Until then, all parties are to maintain respect within these walls." The gavel struck again, and the room stirred with movement as the session recessed. My father leaned toward his lawyer, speaking in hushed but confident tones. Susan smoothed the sleeve of her dress, her eyes flicking toward me only once with disdain. Gregory clapped my father on the back as if victory were already certain. I stepped down from the stand, my knees weak, but before I reached the aisle, I looked again at Emily. She closed her notebook, rose quietly, and when she passed, she whispered just loud enough for me to hear. "Hold on, Daniel. You are not as powerless as they think." I held on to those words as I walked out of the courtroom, the sound of their laughter still trailing behind me like chains. The next morning I drove through downtown Portland with the brass key in my pocket pressing against my leg as if it were alive. Traffic crawled along the wet streets, the sky still heavy with clouds. My hands gripped the wheel tighter than they should have. Each block closer to Wells Fargo made my chest pound harder. When I finally pulled into the parking garage and shut off the engine, I sat for a long moment staring at the concrete wall. The courthouse echoes of my father's voice telling everyone I had no claim still rattled inside my skull. Yet here I was, holding something he knew nothing about. I closed my eyes and whispered to myself that this was not about money. It was about truth, about Eleanor's trust. Inside the bank, the air smelled of polished marble and paper. The lobby was quiet, only a few customers sitting with their deposit slips. I stepped to the counter, sliding the key across to the woman behind the glass. She looked at the tag and then at me. Name, Daniel Whitmore. She typed quickly into her computer, her expression unreadable. After a pause, she nodded. Yes, Mr. Whitmore. This box is under Eleanor Whitmore. You are listed as pre-authorized. Please wait 1 moment. Relief and dread struck at once. Eleanor had planned this carefully. She had made sure no one else could touch it. The clerk gestured for me to follow. My shoes clicked against the marble as we walked through a narrow hallway, down a stairwell, and into a room colder and quieter than the lobby. The scent of metal and dust lingered in the air. The vault door loomed in front of me, steel and massive, its wheel and bolts glinting under fluorescent lights. Another employee appeared with a clipboard, checked my identification, and asked me to sign. My hand trembled as I wrote my name. The sound of the vault unlocking was deep and mechanical, the kind of sound that made you realize you were stepping into a place few ever entered. The clerk guided me past rows of boxes stacked neatly along the walls. We stopped at one marked with the number engraved on my key. My pulse quickened as I slid the key into the lock. It turned smoothly as if it had been waiting for me all along. Together we pulled the long metal box free and set it on a table in a small private room. You may take your time, the clerk said before stepping out and shutting the door. I sat alone, staring at the box. It was heavier than it looked, long and gray cold under my fingertips. For a moment I did not move. I thought of Eleanor's voice, her laugh, her steady presence at every turning point of my life. Then I drew in a deep breath and opened it. The lid creaked softly, and inside lay stacks of leather-bound journals, their covers worn smooth by years of handling. Beside them, wrapped carefully in velvet, were pieces of jewelry that glinted even in the dim light, a string of pearls, a brooch set with diamonds, a gold pocket watch. Underneath those treasures was a thick envelope bulging with documents, and a folded deed with a seal that read Cannon Beach. My breath caught. She had not lied. There was a home by the sea, hidden away from every greedy hand. I touched the journals first, running my fingers over the cracked spines. Each one held years of her handwriting. I could almost see her sitting in her chair by the window, pen in hand, pouring her life onto these pages. Then I picked up the envelope of documents. They were official, stamped and signed contracts and receipts. I skimmed enough to recognize names tied to my Uncle Gregory's construction company, and even references to payments rooted strangely. My head spun. I leaned back, clutching the papers, trying to steady my breathing. This was not just a gift. This was evidence. This was the kind of truth that could dismantle everything my father and uncle had built. I closed the box again, the metal echoing as it shut. My hands were still shaking. I knew I could not stay in that room forever. The clerk knocked softly before entering. All finished, sir. Yes, thank you. We slid the box back into place, locked it, and stepped out into the vault. The air felt heavier now, as though the weight of what I carried in my mind had seeped into the room. Back in the lobby, I signed the release slip and tucked the key deep into my pocket. Outside, the city bustled as if nothing had changed, but for me, everything had. The rain had started again, drops striking the pavement in rhythmic taps. I stood on the steps of the bank, the gray sky above me, my chest tight with the knowledge of what I now held. It was not just pearls and property. It was a buried past, secrets written in my grandmother's hand. Proof of corruption tied to my own blood. As I walked back toward my car, the key warm in my hand, I knew I had opened more than a metal box. I had opened a door to a truth that none of them wanted revealed. A door that once crossed could never be shut again. I drove home with the weight of the vault pressing on me. The box had felt like it carried more than paper and metal. And when I laid the contents across my kitchen table that afternoon, I knew I was right. There were journals bound in worn leather, a velvet pouch of jewelry, an official deed stamped Cannon Beach, and a thick envelope stuffed with contracts and receipts. I sat staring at them, afraid to touch anything. Finally, I reached for the first journal. The pages smelled faintly of lavender and dust, her handwriting steady across the lines. She wrote about long shifts at Good Samaritan Hospital in the 1950s, saving for her first duplex baking pies for tenants. It was the record of a woman who built everything from the ground up. But as the years passed, the tone shifted. She described my father, Richard, pressuring her to sign documents she didn't fully understand. My uncle Gregory insisting shortcuts would save money. She wrote of sleepless nights of papers shoved under her nose with reassurances that never felt true. I closed the journal and opened the envelope. Contracts stamped with Whitmore Construction. Wire transfers to a company I didn't recognize, Redwood Pacific Consulting. Round figures for vague services like permit facilitation. Gregory's signature scrawled bold across approvals and my father's pen on a letter requesting expedited permits. My head pounded. This wasn't just family business, it was fraud. I flipped through a later journal from the 2000s. The entries were shorter, sharper. She wrote about meetings with Mr. Alden, about asking what would happen if she refused to sign. He had told her to slow down to keep everything documented. She wrote that Richard accused her of betrayal, Gregory of being old-fashioned. She felt small in her own home. I set the papers in order, tracing payments on a notepad. 3 transfers in 1 year alone matched permits Gregory had bragged about. I circled dates, copied account numbers, and felt sweat on my palms. My grandmother had kept a trail hidden carefully, waiting for someone to follow it. Next, I lifted the deed. A county seal confirmed the cottage at Cannon Beach was held in her trust outside the estate, now being fought over in court. She had shielded it. My name was noted as successor. My chest tightened at the thought of the small house on the bluff windows facing the sea. I remembered childhood summers. The smell of salt her laugh carried on the wind. The jewelry lay in the pouch, pearls, a diamond brooch, a gold pocket watch engraved with initials and the year of her marriage. I snapped the watch open and stared at the tiny hands ticking alive with a history no court could erase. I went back to the journals and found an entry that shook me. She wrote about a dinner where my father mocked me in front of everyone. She admitted she had wanted to defend me but could not find the words. Then she wrote that love was not loud, that sometimes love was a key placed quietly in a drawer, waiting for the right hands. I sat back, eyes burning. She had chosen me not for money but for trust. She knew they would fight, knew greed would consume them, and she had armed me with truth. I pulled out my phone and messaged Emily Parker. I told her I needed her help with something tied to the estate. She replied within minutes, said she would clear time tomorrow, and told me to bring whatever I had. I gathered the documents into a manila folder, slipped the journals into a tote, and locked them in a small file case I usually used for grades. I put the key on a chain around my neck. Before shutting the lamp, I wrote on a clean sheet of paper, "Protect the truth." I placed it on top of the stack so it would be the first thing I saw in the morning. As night settled, I opened the blinds and looked out at the streetcar gliding past, lights glowing against the damp pavement. My reflection in the glass looked tired but steadier than the boy humiliated at the funeral. I touched the chain at my neck where the key rested. This was not only an inheritance, it was a weapon hidden in plain sight, and I was the only one who knew how to use it. I pulled one of the heavier journals onto my lap, the leather cover cracked at the corners, the year written in my grandmother's steady hand. My fingers hesitated before opening it, afraid of what I might find inside, afraid of seeing her fears written plainly in ink. When I finally turned the first page, I felt like I had stepped into another time. The entry began with her years as a young nurse at Good Samaritan in the 1950s. She described endless nights in the emergency ward, the smell of antiseptic that never left her clothes, the exhaustion that sat in her bones but never broke her resolve. She wrote of saving money $1 at a time, how she rented a small room in North Portland and walked to work through the rain. She recalled the day she put down the deposit for her first duplex, how she baked an apple pie to celebrate alone, proud but already thinking of the next step. I turned the page and saw a list of tenants' names neatly written with small notes beside each. One paid late but always brought flowers to the porch, another shoveled snow for neighbors in winter. She cared for them not as numbers but as people, and I felt my throat tighten. As the years moved forward, her words darkened. She wrote about my father Richard, once ambitious and sharp, who had just passed the bar. At first, she believed he would safeguard the family's growing properties. She described how proud she was watching him in his first suit, how she thought he would bring honor to the Whitmore name. But the trust cracked quickly. She recorded the first time he placed papers in front of her without explanation. She asked questions and he dismissed them with a smile, telling her it was only routine. She signed, but later that night she could not sleep. Then came Gregory, younger but louder, already knee-deep in construction deals. She wrote of his promises to fast-track renovations to multiply profits. But beneath the promises were shortcuts and falsified permits. She wrote that both Richard and Gregory began showing up together, pressing her at the kitchen table, urging her to sign new agreements. She captured her own trembling hand as she held the pen, the way her stomach knotted as she put ink on paper she did not understand. I stopped reading and pressed my palms against my face. The journals were not just records, they were confessions. She had written down her own doubts, her own guilt for letting them lead her. I could almost see her hunched over the desk lamplight, spilling across the page, fighting the weight of her own sons. I turned to an entry dated October 1998. She wrote about refusing to sign a contract Gregory had drafted. He raised his voice, accused her of holding the family back. Richard told her she was too old to understand modern deals. She stood her ground that night, but felt her resolve weaken in the days that followed. She admitted to Mr. Alden later that she feared her own children would ruin everything she had built. His advice was simple: write everything down. So she did. The ink grew heavier on the pages, strokes darker, as if she pressed the pen harder with each passing year. She recorded payments that did not make sense, permits approved suspiciously fast, whispers about city officials meeting Gregory in private. She noted conversations where Richard assured her the money was safe only to move funds into accounts she had never heard of. And then in one entry from 2005, my breath caught. She wrote a message to me. Not to the family, not a record for court, but to me, Daniel. I know they do not see you. They call you weak, they call you unworthy, but you are the one I trust. They will destroy themselves with their greed. Do not follow their path. The words blurred as my eyes filled. I pressed the journal against my chest and let out a sound I had been holding for years. Hot tears slid down my face as the room around me dissolved. I remembered her hand on my shoulder when I graduated college, the way she told me that teaching was a noble path, even if no one else believed it. I remembered the cookies she slipped me at dinner, the quiet smile when my father mocked me in front of the family. She had seen me even when no one else did. I wiped my face with the back of my sleeve and read on. She had written more, urging me to be patient, to let truth speak when the time was right. She reminded me that silence could be strength if it was purposeful. She promised me that the records she kept were not just for her conscience but for me, so that one day I would know the truth of what they had done. I closed the journal and sat in the silence of my apartment. My hands still shook, but my chest felt lighter. It was as if she had reached across years and placed her hand in mine. I looked at the stack of journals, the manila folder of contracts, the deed to Cannon Beach. And I knew these were not just relics. They were a map, a shield, and a weapon all at once. I opened another volume at random and found more entries where she described the tension in family gatherings. One Christmas she wrote that Richard ridiculed me in front of the cousins for choosing to teach instead of law. She admitted she wanted to defend me but stayed silent, and later she wept alone. She wrote that her silence had been cowardice, that she hoped someday she could make it right. I closed the book, unable to read further. I sat back and let the weight of her words settle into me. She had carried regret, fear, and shame, but beneath it all, she had carried faith in me. That faith was now mine to bear, heavier than any fortune. I gathered the journals into a careful stack, placed the folder of documents on top, and sat staring at them until the daylight faded from the window. My tears had dried, but a strange calm replaced them. For the first time I understood fully. She had not just left me inheritance. She had left me her belief written across decades. I pressed my hand to the journals one last time before turning off the lamp. In the quiet, her words echoed inside me, steady and unshakable. They will destroy themselves with their greed. Do not follow their path. The dining room was filled with the heavy smell of roasted meat and wine, but none of it touched me. I sat at the far end of the long table while my father and mother held court at the head. Their voices sharp and deliberate. Relatives whispered along the sides, some pretending to eat, others glancing at me with pity or disdain. I had been summoned to this dinner, though I knew it was no invitation. My father Richard tapped his glass with a fork and the chatter died. He pulled a crisp document from a leather folder and laid it in front of me. The paper slid across the polished wood until it stopped against my plate. His voice carried no warmth. This is a waiver, Daniel. It releases any claim you might pretend to have on the estate. Sign it and we can all move forward. My mother Susan leaned forward, her jeweled hand resting on his. She smiled tightly, her eyes cold. It is the decent thing, Daniel. Your grandmother spoiled you for too long. This is the time to show respect for the family and step aside. I stared at the black ink, the lines already marked where my signature was expected. The silence stretched until Gregory broke it with a chuckle. He leaned back in his chair, his gold watch flashing under the chandelier. Look, kid, no one's saying you can't eat at the table. Work with us. I've got a spot for you at Whitmore Construction. You keep your head down, sign this paper, and I'll make sure you're taken care of. Call it family protection." I felt the sting before I heard the laugh. David Gregory's son, only 30 and already bloated with arrogance, leaned forward, his tie, loosened wineglass in hand, a high school teacher holding on to his grandmother's skirts. "Tell me, Uncle Daniel, how exactly do you plan to manage anything? You can't even afford a new car. What do you think you can keep from us?" The table broke into scattered laughter, a chorus of approval for cruelty. My fork trembled against the plate. My father's voice cut through it, calm and hard. "Do what is right for once. Sign and let us handle matters like men of business." I lifted my eyes from the page and met his gaze. For the first time, I did not look away. My voice shook at first, then steadied. "I will not sign." The laughter died instantly, replaced by a thick silence. Gregory's smirk faltered. My mother's lips pressed thin, her hand tightening on the stem of her glass. My father's face reddened, the calm mask slipping. He leaned forward, both hands flat on the table. "Do you think you can defy me? Do you think a pile of her notebooks changes who runs this family?" I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering in my ears, and said the words that had been waiting for years. "I will not let you smear her name." For a moment no one moved. The chandelier hummed overhead, the clock on the mantel ticked loud enough for everyone to hear. My father's nostrils flared and his fists curled against the wood. My mother shook her head in disbelief, whispering that I was ungrateful. David sneered, muttering that I was pathetic. Gregory raised his glass again as if to dissolve the tension, but his eyes were sharp. I pushed the paper back across the table, the edge scratching the wood. My voice did not rise, but it carried. "I will not betray her, and I will not betray myself." The silence that followed was colder than any words they could have thrown. My father sat back slowly, his jaw tight, his eyes filled with something between fury and recognition. My mother turned her face away. Gregory clinked his glass against his teeth and laughed once, hollow and strained. David muttered under his breath, but I no longer cared. I stood the legs of my chair, scraping loudly against the floor. No one stopped me as I walked away from the table. Behind me I could hear my father's voice, low and venomous, telling the others that I would regret this, that I would learn what it meant to cross him. I stepped out into the cold night air, the weight of their eyes still clinging to my back. But for the first time in years, I felt my spine straight. My grandmother's words echoed inside me, steady and unbreakable. "They will destroy themselves with their greed." And I knew I had just taken the first step to make sure of it. The next afternoon, I met Emily at a quiet coffee shop off Hawthorne. She had reserved the back corner table, her briefcase already open beside her chair. Her eyes scanned me as I slid into the seat, searching for signs of hesitation. I set the manila folder on the table between us and exhaled. She adjusted her glasses, her voice low. "Are you sure you want to do this here?" I nodded. "It's time." She opened the folder carefully, pulling out the contracts, the wire transfers, the photocopied memos with handwritten notes. Her brows tightened as she moved through them, flipping back and forth to check dates and amounts. After a long silence, she leaned back. "Daniel, this is serious. This is fraud on a scale that could bury them if the right people see it." Before I could answer, another voice joined us. Michael Torres appeared at the edge of the table, tall, his coat still damp from the drizzle outside. He had been my roommate in college before journalism pulled him into the whirlwind of city politics and corruption cases. I had called him the night before, and when he heard the word Whitmore, he did not hesitate. He shook my hand firmly. "Good to see you again, brother." Then he looked at the stack of papers like a predator spotting prey. "So this is what they were hiding." Emily shot him a warning look. "We need to be careful. If this goes public too fast, it could destroy what's left of the family. Michael pulled out a yellow notepad and began scribbling. These payments to Redwood Pacific, the timing matches 3 different development approvals I covered years ago. I always suspected something, but I never had the paper. You've got the paper. This isn't just a family squabble. This is public interest. I watched them volley back and forth, Emily's cautious tone clashing with Michael's hungry urgency. My chest tightened. To me, these were not just contracts and bank slips. They were my grandmother's nights of fear, her careful handwriting in the margins of journals her trust placed in me. Emily leaned closer, her voice softening. Daniel, if you let Michael run with this, your father and uncle will be ruined. Your mother, too. The Whitmore name could vanish from every boardroom, every social circle. Are you ready to be the one who lit that fire? Michael countered without missing a beat. And if he stays quiet, he betrays her. Look at this. These aren't technical mistakes. This is theft and laundering, plain and simple. Judges would salivate to see evidence like this. I stared at the papers, my reflection faint in the glossy surface of the table. Silence pressed heavy in the space between their voices. Emily reached across, touched my wrist gently. You have to decide what justice means to you. I closed my eyes and heard Eleanor's words again. Do not follow their path. They will destroy themselves with their greed. I opened my eyes and said it out loud. Then let them destroy themselves. But they won't drag her name with them. Emily withdrew her hand slowly, her eyes searching mine. You're sure? I nodded firmer this time. I'll use it. Michael leaned back, a satisfied grin spreading across his face. Then we do it smart. We don't just drop it all at once. We line it up, build the trail so clear no one can deny it. If we play it right, not only do they fall, but the whole city sees who kept them honest. Emily sighed, gathering the documents back into the folder. Then we'll need copies. Originals stay safe. And Daniel, you cannot carry this alone anymore. Her words hit me harder than I expected. For months I had felt alone, pressed against walls of contempt and silence. Now, sitting at that table with a lawyer who believed in me and a journalist who smelled blood, I felt the ground shift. The weapon my grandmother left me was no longer hidden. It was drawn. We packed the papers, exchanged numbers, and set a plan to meet again in 2 days. When I stepped back into the drizzle, the air tasted sharper, as if the city itself had shifted. The traffic roared past, indifferent to the quiet war that had just begun in the back of a coffee shop. I pulled my coat tighter and walked toward the river, the folder clutched against my chest. The choice was made. The truth would not stay in shadows. It would burn its way into the open, and I would be the one to strike the match. I drove the winding road toward the coast, the air growing saltier with each mile, the trees bending in the stiff wind. When I crested the hill and saw the ocean spread out before me, a sharp ache cut through my chest. The cottage stood on a bluff overlooking Cannon Beach, weathered shingles silvered by decades of salt and sun. I parked on the gravel path and stepped out, the cry of gulls overhead, the crash of waves carrying through the air like a drum beat. The key fit easily in the lock. When I pushed the door open, sunlight spilled across worn wooden floors. The place smelled faintly of cedar and sea air, like the summers I remembered as a boy. Curtains swayed in the breeze, sneaking through the cracked windows. The rooms were small but filled with warmth. A quilt still rested on the couch, folded neatly as if waiting for her return. I walked through slowly, touching the backs of chairs, the cool brass of a lamp, the edge of the old bookshelf where my initials were carved faintly from when I was 10. Every corner carried her presence. In the kitchen, a teacup sat upside down in the dish rack dust, clinging to its rim. I opened cupboards out of habit, finding jars of faded spices, tins of tea leaves long expired. In the back bedroom, a wardrobe stood against the wall, its paint chipped but sturdy. I tugged it open and found a stack of linens folded carefully. At the bottom, hidden beneath a faded quilt, was a smaller box. My pulse quickened as I set it on the bed and opened it. Inside were more journals, thinner than the ones from the vault, their covers worn soft from handling. I picked up the top one, dated 2010, and sat on the edge of the bed with the waves pounding in the distance. Her handwriting ran across the pages firmer than in the earlier years. She wrote about trips to the coast, about tending the small garden out back, about quiet evenings with tea. But soon the tone shifted. She began to detail meetings Gregory arranged with a city planning official, a man named Harold Kent. She wrote that he came to dinner once, that he spoke with too much ease about zoning approvals, that Gregory slipped him envelopes in plain sight. She recorded amounts, dates, even the names of projects. My hand tightened around the page. This was not just family corruption. This was a thread tied to City Hall. I flipped further. She described how Harold Kent laughed at her concerns, telling her progress required grease. She wrote that Richard defended the practice as common in business, and Gregory gloated that it saved months of red tape. She ended one entry with words underlined twice. "This is not business, this is rot." I set the journal down and stood pacing the small room. Outside, the ocean roared louder, the tide pushing against the rocks as if echoing her anger. I pressed my palms to the window glass, watching the surf crash against the shore. My grandmother had carried this knowledge alone for years, knowing that exposing it would tear apart not only the family but the city leaders who allowed it. I returned to the bed and read another entry. "Daniel, if they corner you, if they try to silence you, open everything. Do not hold back. The city must see who they are." The words struck deep, heavier than anything I had read before. She had prepared me not only for a fight with my family, but for a storm that could sweep through Portland itself. My throat tightened as I imagined Harold Kent standing beside my uncle, shaking hands, their smiles wide, while money moved under the table. I closed the journal and set it beside me. The wind rattled the windows, the surf pounded, and I felt as if the house itself urged me forward. I thought of Emily's caution, Michael's hunger, and my grandmother's steady hand, guiding me from the grave. I packed the journals into my bag, pausing only to look once more around the room. The quilt on the bed, the small lamp by the chair, the photographs on the wall of sunsets over the sea. This cottage was her refuge, her safeguard against the greed that consumed the rest of them. And now it was mine. As I stepped outside, the late afternoon light bathed the water in gold waves, slamming hard against the shore. The wind whipped at my jacket, pulling at my hair. I stood at the edge of the bluff, the weight of the new journals in my bag, and heard her words as if she whispered them in my ear. "If they push you to the edge, let it all out." I closed my eyes and let the roar of the sea fill me. This was no longer just a family inheritance. It was a reckoning that reached far beyond bloodlines. The tide was rising, and with it the truth she had hidden for decades. When I walked into the courthouse again, the folder under my arm felt heavier than ever. Emily was already waiting by the bench, her posture straight, her eyes steady. Michael leaned against the wall beside her, a press badge clipped to his jacket pocket, his phone buzzing constantly with updates from the newsroom. We entered the chamber together, the sound of murmurs swelling as we stepped inside. Judge Keller sat at the bench, her silver hair neat, her gaze sharp. My father and mother were already at the table with their attorneys, their clothes immaculate, their expressions a mix of disdain and unease. Gregory sat next to them, sweat gathering at his brow despite the cool air. David was in the row behind his jaw-tight eyes, darting nervously. Emily stood first, her voice calm as she presented the trust deed for the Cannon Beach cottage. She laid out the language Eleanor had written years ago, naming me sole successor and beneficiary of that property. The opposing counsel tried to object, but Judge Keller lifted a hand, silencing him with a glance. Then Michael stepped forward as a witness. He had brought copies of the articles his paper was ready to publish. He spoke of the trail of payments, the consulting firm that was nothing but a shell, the connections to city planning approvals. He detailed each contract, each suspicious transfer, each signature in Gregory's broad hand and Richard's practiced scrawl. The courtroom buzzed as the stack of evidence grew higher. Reporters scribbled in their notepads, cameras flashed from the back. Gregory's lawyer fumbled, trying to dismiss the documents as circumstantial, but the dates and amounts matched too neatly. Judge Keller's pen scratched notes, her expression unreadable. My father's voice cut through the tension when he rose. He called it slander, a betrayal by a bitter son desperate for attention. His words carried weight, but his eyes betrayed the first cracks I had ever seen in him. My mother whispered to him to sit, her hand gripping his sleeve tightly. Finally, the judge turned to me. "Mr. Whitmore, do you have anything to say?" I rose slowly, my palms damp, but my voice came steady. My grandmother left me something more than property. She left me the truth. She wrote down everything because she knew one day their greed would consume them. She left me the key to bury it, and I will not let her name be dragged through the mud. The room went silent. My father glared at me, his face flushed, his lips pressed tight. My mother's eyes glistened with anger and disbelief. Gregory shifted in his chair, his bravado gone. Judge Keller looked down at the papers, then at the deed again. After a long pause, she spoke. "The evidence of fraudulent activity will be referred to the district attorney's office for investigation. Regarding the Cannon Beach property, the trust is valid. It passes solely to Daniel Whitmore." The words landed like thunder. Gregory's head dropped into his hands. Richard slammed a fist on the table, his attorney whispering frantically in his ear. Susan covered her face with her hands, her shoulders trembling. The family that had mocked me, that had tried to cut me out and strip me bare, was unraveling in front of everyone. Michael's phone buzzed again, the headline already drafted. "Whitmore Dynasty Tainted by Fraud Allegations." Emily closed her briefcase with quiet finality, her glance at me carrying both pride and caution. As the gavel struck and the session ended, my father leaned across the table, his voice low, but sharp enough for me to hear. "You think you've won? This family is bigger than you." I looked him straight in the eye for the first time in my life. "She left me the key that buried your greed, and now the world will see you for what you are." He pulled back as if struck, his voice pale beneath the courtroom lights. Around us, relatives whispered, some avoiding our eyes, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The Whitmore name that once carried power and privilege now lay in pieces on the marble floor. I walked out into the crisp Portland air with Emily and Michael beside me. The courthouse loomed behind, but I did not look back. The tide had risen, the truth had crashed through their walls, and greed had finally swallowed itself whole. The sea air was sharp as I stood on the porch of the Cannon Beach cottage, the wooden boards creaking under my weight. I held the brass key in my palm, the same one my grandmother had left for me, the one that opened the vault, the one that opened the truth. Below me the tide rolled in, foaming and endless, the sound crashing against the bluff like a steady drumbeat. For a long time I simply stared at the horizon. The sun was low, turning the waves copper and gold. In that light I no longer saw myself as the poor teacher mocked at family dinners, the forgotten son cut out of inheritance. I felt the weight of Eleanor's hand on my shoulder, her faith in me written across decades of journals, and I understood. I was not a victim. I was the keeper of her honor. The world had shifted quickly after the courthouse. Michael's articles ran in 3 parts, each one revealing more contracts, more payments, more evidence of collusion. Names of city officials appeared beside Gregory's, their careers ending in the span of a headline. The Whitmore reputation, once polished and untouchable, rotted in public view. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid Richard and Susan. Investors withdrew from Gregory's projects. David's friends, once eager to brag about their connection to the Whitmores, vanished. Karma did not need to be forced. It unfolded like a tide, pulling back everything they had stolen. They had tried to bury me, to humiliate me, to strip me of worth. Instead, they buried themselves in their greed. I walked through the cottage and paused by the wardrobe where I had found her hidden journals. My fingers brushed the rough paint and I whispered into the quiet. "They did not win, Grandma. You did." I set the key down on the kitchen table beside the deed that bore my name alone. This house was more than property. It was a sanctuary, a place she had chosen carefully to protect what mattered most. As I traced the edge of the paper, I thought of the last words I had spoken to my father. "She left me the key that buried your greed." Those words had cut him deeper than any headline could. Outside, gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp against the sound of the surf. I stepped back onto the porch, lifting the key once more. The wind tugged at my jacket and filled my lungs with salt and cold. I remembered the moment at her funeral when they had grabbed for $12 million in front of the whole family, their hunger unashamed. They thought they had stripped me of everything, but the truth was stronger than their money. At her funeral they stole, but it was her secret key that buried them. I closed my fist around the key and felt its weight steady in my hand. I was no longer the shadow in the corner. I was the one carrying forward the only inheritance that mattered: dignity, truth, and the strength not to follow their path. The waves crashed below as if sealing the moment. I let the key rest against my chest, then slipped it back into my pocket. The fight was over. The lesson remained: greed destroys, truth endures, family is not blood but trust. Those are the words I carry now, the words I hope someone else will hear when they need them most. If this story held you, if it made you think of your own family, of the dangers of greed and the power of truth, then stay with me. Like, share, and subscribe so more people can hear stories that remind us what really matters.